I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. On November 10th, thousands of protesters marched in the French capital city of Paris against rising Islamophobia. This protest happened 2 weeks after an 84-year-old man attacked a mosque in Bayonne and seriously injured 2 men. Now, all across the world, there is this growing realization that Muslims are under attack, specifically for their religious identity. And France, it hosts the biggest Muslim minority in Western Europe, is often at the center of this discussion when talking about Islamophobia. On today's show, we take a closer look at how events are unfolding in the country regarding the Muslim minority. Joining us for this discussion is Leonard Faytre, who is a research assistant at the Foundation of Sector Education and Training Authority. He joins us from Istanbul. We're also joined by Mr. Yasser Louati, who is the head of the Justice and Liberties for All Committee. He joins us from Paris. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Yasser, I'd like to begin with you. Now, these were massive demonstrations. Thousands of people came out on the streets to talk about something that has been very hotly debated in France for not just now, but for many, many years. What did you think about this protest?
Well, the protest itself that took place on Sunday is the third one that took place since the end of the month of October. A wave of multiple campaigns were launched to again demonize Muslims at the request of the current government of Emmanuel Macron. As usual, the same argument, the Muslim headscarf, so-called radicalization, Muslim identity, French identity, etc. And the attack that took place against a mosque in Bayonne now proved that the political rhetoric or the violent racist rhetoric taking place today in France has opened the way to legitimize violence against Muslims. And this growing fear, outrage, and even anger by French Muslims only needed a platform to express itself. So there was a rally on the 27th of October against Islamophobia. Another one took place before the headquarters of a mainstream news channel that has given a platform to Eric Zemmour, a notorious Islamophobe who's calling for the deportation of Muslims. And of course, the march that took place 2 days ago in Paris. So this is now only the beginning of mobilizations by Muslims themselves against Islamophobia and the silence of the political elite, starting with the French state.
Right. Now, there are a couple of things I want to pick out specifically from what you've told us, but I'll start off from this. You're talking about how this mobilization is just the beginning for French Muslims who want to show their discontent, who want to have a platform to voice their feelings about the discrimination they've been feeling. But during these protests, was the majority of the demographic Muslims? Were there other people supporting them? Were there other members of society in these protests?
Now, this is where a problematic arises. Is the demonstration organized last Sunday was actually organized by the far-left parties, that of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the unsubmissive France, who's unfortunately notorious for his anti-Muslim rhetoric in terms of I do not recognize Islamophobia, we have the right to criticize religion. And when the question of Islamophobia and discrimination and the growing discontent of Muslims was brought to him even a few months ago, he stood by and said, we are sick and tired of people showing their religious identity. We don't want another war of religions. What he failed to acknowledge is that first, Muslims are not in a logic of war or contest or anything. They just want equality and peace like anybody else. The second point is that he does not want to acknowledge the colonial heritage that's constantly coming as to haunt French public debate, specific legislations against Muslims and minorities, etc. Now, because we are 5 months away from the local municipal elections, we see that these politicians are using the Muslim anger against Islamophobia to have themselves perceived as their natural allies who are going to stand for them. For example, the question is, why haven't those left-wing parties mobilized when 2 other events were organized by Muslims? They didn't show up and didn't advertise them. But this event was hijacked by far-left parties in order for them to prepare the upcoming local elections against, of course, the right-wing rhetoric taken by Emmanuel Macron, Marine Le Pen of the far right, and of course the mainstream conservative party, Les Républicains.
Right. So from what I gather, you're saying here that the fact that the leftist parties were arranging this protest, were hijacking this protest, it was all for political mileage for the upcoming elections. That's something we're going to talk about later on in the show as well, what is happening on the political front of this all. But before that, I'd like to jump to Leonard and bring him into this conversation. Now, Leonard, when we talk about secularism in France, it's a very complicated concept. Because secularism in France is seen to be colorblind. It's seen to not take into consideration people's religious beliefs or anything. That would mean that there is a degree of freedom. But on the other hand, we also see some of the most oppressive laws against Muslims being imposed in France. How do we make sense of this concept?
Thank you very much for inviting me, first of all. Actually, every time in every country, there's the law in one side and the interpretation of the law. So if we just look at the law in itself, of course, if we interpret in the liberal way, we can see that this law permits Muslims to live their Islam the way they want. Everyone from any faith can live as they want in France because the states do not recognize any religion. So it does not promote, according to the law, does not promote any religion in particular. So this is for the law. But there are many other interpretations of this law who are, as you said, more severely, more strictly secular, and those interpretations actually are preventing people who believe from showing their faith outside their home, outside the house. So, according to those interpretations, religious people should not show off their religion outside. But what does it mean? What does it mean to showing off your religion? For example, for Muslim, it would be to wear a headscarf, or having a beard, or wearing a white clothes. So this is unclear. And of course, like those people are using this kind of strict interpretation for preventing Muslims from living their religion in a free way. So actually, we should look at not at the law in itself, but at the reasons of this kind of interpretations. Why in France, most of politicians and journalists, scholars, also people who are very well educated, we don't speak about average people, why those well educated people are spreading in the public sphere this hard and strict interpretation of secularism in France? I think this is the important question.
Yeah, it is an essential question, and let's move towards trying to understand and deconstruct this question and trying to understand where this history begins. Now, what has been happening in France is not new. I mean, if we go back to 1989, where the headscarf affair occurred, where 3 students were discriminated against for wearing headscarves, I mean, there's a long legacy of discrimination. What is fueling this, and why is it increasing so sharply in the years we're seeing unfold right now?
Yeah, actually there's, I would say, 3 main reasons behind what you just said. First of all, in France for now centuries, the modern French state, if you want, has been built against the Catholic Church. So this is the kind of anti-clerical discourse who is dominant in French politics. This is the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer, it is this, as Yasser Louati just said before, and I totally agree with him upon that, there is a colonial heritage in France. And there is a post-colonial discourse who is going on in France, and who see any citizens who is not a white and a non-Christian citizen, it is a tendency to see them as a second-class citizens. So everyone who is not from the white and Christian heritage who will be seen as a second-class, second-zone citizen. Right. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear perfectly fine. Yasser, I'm just going to jump to you and talk to you about this. Now, Leonard is describing for us the identity of an acceptable French citizen. Now, in all of this, I do want to understand, when we're talking about discrimination, racial discrimination, discrimination against those who hold certain religious beliefs, is it just the Muslim minority that is facing the brunt of this?
Well, actually, Muslims, like I said multiple times in public speaking, is that they represent the barometer of the rule of law and democracy in France. Because all things that go wrong in France, they first target the most vulnerable minority, and today it's the Muslims. Yesterday it was the Jews, the Poles before that, even the Catholics after the French Revolution. So today it materializes in terms of discrimination in jobs, housing, access to healthcare, political representation, police brutality, and the list goes on. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves, to what extent this can go on and how far can the state go? When we look at the state of emergency that took place after the 2015 attacks, we see that the French state entered as a logic of retaliation against Muslims that were perceived as the enemy within and that must be held accountable for the attacks, even if Muslims themselves were killed during those attacks. When it comes to access to the job market, if you are a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf in France, according to statistics made available by the European Network Against Racism in Brussels, you stand a 1% chance of receiving a positive answer for your job application. 1% if you're wearing a headscarf. If you are just perceived as a Muslim because of your skin color or because of your name or last name, you have to apply 5 times more than the average candidate just to receive an invitation for an interview. And if you are, for example, a Muslim male in France, you are between 9 to 20 times more likely of being harassed by the police through racial profiling in the street or elsewhere. And this is where it becomes problematic. At what point are you going to consider these people third, fourth generation of French citizens? When are you going to say, okay, they are equal to us and their demands for equality are legitimate? So far, we don't see it coming. Anytime Muslims speak up against an injustice or a specific law of exception, they are treated as the radical Muslims who want to overthrow the republic. But Muslims are not in that logic. They just seek equality. There's a famous saying that says, when you are accustomed to privilege, equality seems like oppression. And this is exactly what we're witnessing today with French Muslims. And what makes things even worse, not only we have what we call secular fundamentalists, or the laïcards in French, not only we have the hard right or the far right pushing identity politics, but we also have the French state agreeing with both of them by stigmatizing Muslims.
Right. Those are some very powerful figures laid out right in front of us. The extent of the discrimination and how systematic it is. Since we're short on time, I do want to get to more answers. When we're talking about this, we're talking about systematic discrimination, not just being carried out by the state, but also by various stakeholders within society. How difficult is it to collect data regarding this? How difficult is it to report this? Now, Yasser talked about how even dissenting voices are silenced in these matters. During your research, did you feel like the data reflected that?
Of course, the data reflects this. There are different difficulties for concerning reporting Islamophobia in France. First, we don't have any statistics based on religion or on race in France. It is forbidden. So there's a good reason for that, because like the state don't want to divide the country different racial and religious categories. But yet we don't have like clear numbers about Islamophobia in France or any hate crimes regarding any religions in France. Yet there are some NGOs who are reporting and monitoring Islamophobia. Victims feel more comfortable to report their attack towards those kind of NGOs instead of reporting to police stations, because as just Yasser Louati said, Islamophobia is also very well expressed in police station and is official institutions. So that's why most of the time Muslims do not report their attack to official institutions, but they report them, some of them report their attack to NGOs. So through those kind of statistics, we can have a statistical ID, a material ID of Islamophobia in France. But the most important is the qualitative studies And we should make field researches in France, discuss with people, make also discourse analysis. If you look at the state of the media today in France, it's very difficult. Like people, scholars, intellectuals, politicians from left to right are very spreading anti-Muslims propaganda. So by doing this kind of research, more qualitative research, we can have an idea of the reality of Islamophobia in France.
Right. Yasser, just to wrap what we've been discussing now, you talked about how dissenting voices and how Muslims speaking out are discriminated against. They don't have space. But you also mentioned how this protest was one of the three protests that took place in this month alone. Do you feel like French Muslims are finally trying to regain the space that they once had? Or do you feel like they're trying to gather a space and trying to find their voice in public discourse?
Well, actually, the question is very interesting, and I thank you for that. From what we have seen so far at the organization is that in field research, Muslims have been trying to organize for years, but it has been made impossible because multiple organizations are either outlets or satellites of the French state through funding, subsidies, etc. Others are funded by foreign governments who have no interest in seeing the emancipation of local Muslim communities, so they keep them as affiliates for whatever foreign policy purposes. And the last one is that they often affiliate with political parties who are not interested in targeting Islamophobia and racism as a whole through structural solutions and addressing the colonial foundations of the current Fifth Republic that we live under since 1958, but for them it's only to use Muslims as voters, and once they come to power, they just disregard their demands. So now there is an open way, or what can I say, more calls and more initiatives for Muslims to organize on an autonomous basis. And that way is perceived as the most dangerous one by political leaders, by the state, by foreign powers. Why? Because Muslims would be able to think for themselves, organize by themselves, and act on their own without having to seek permission from any stakeholder in society. And this path towards political autonomy or organizing is the same path that allowed Jews, for example, or homosexuals to organize outside of the grip of the state and to push for more equality at their benefit. And as long as Muslims have to depend on various state organizations, etc., this will become impossible. And the march, unfortunately, of Sunday got coverage, was highly advertised in the media because left-wing parties used it.
So Yasser, sorry to interrupt. This is the last question I'm going to put to you. Now, what do you see happening after the elections? Now, as you mentioned, this was the leftist parties that participated in this have had a track record for Islamophobic comments, for Islamophobic actions. Now, given that they're participating in this, and when the elections are over, what do you see happening?
What we see happening, what we have seen happening in the past 40 years, they will use Muslims as the massive voters for them. Once they get to power, they will give positions on a token basis to some individuals, but they will never address, for example, questioning the 2004 law that bans the Muslim headscarf in public schools, even though legal scholars agree it's a clear violation of the secular law. They will not go against the 2010 ban against the Muslim veil, full-face veil, because again, it prohibits you from expressing your religious identity in the public space. They will not open their political party leadership to people who are not white, non-Christians. So again, they will only use them to get to power, but power fundamentally will remain within white hands.
Right. On that point, we're going to have to end this discussion here since we've run out of time. But thank you so much, Mr. Yasser Louati, for joining us from Paris, and Leonard Faytre for joining us from Istanbul. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back. UN statistics show that some 35 million people are estimated to suffer from drug use around the world, and a large majority of these individuals belong to the age group of 12 to 17. On today's show, we take a closer look at these numbers and try to understand how and why young people, especially students, are going to become more likely to consume drugs. Joining us for this discussion today is Geoff Barton, the General Secretary of the Association of School and Colleges Leader. He joins us from Leicester. Also joining us is Professor Atholl Johnston, clinical pharmacologist at the Queen Mary University, joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, Professor Johnston, statistics, those compiled by the United Nations, show that there is an upward trend in drug consumption. And many of these drugs are also those that can be handed out over the counter. What do you see happening? Why do you think that there's this explosion in drug consumption that we're witnessing today?
Well, I think that's a lot to do with developing countries becoming more developed and becoming suffering from some of the problems that we already have in the developed world. If you look at the UK statistics, actually our drug consumption is going down or staying constant. So last year, for example, the amount of cannabis that was smoked fell. The cocaine was roughly constant, and Class A drugs in general, that's the morphine, etc., actually fell over time. And the trend is downwards because we are beginning to get a handle on this, because there's no point in us sitting here blaming Afghanistan for producing heroin. We're the ones who are buying it, and it should be the Western countries we need to be blaming for this, because we're the ones consuming it. We're the ones who are generating demand.
Right, and you're talking about how you guys have tried to get a handle on the situation. What does that entail? What legislations have strengthened? What measures have been taken to try to take control of the situation?
I think ultimately legislation plays some part, but it isn't what conquers drug use. It's education. We need to educate people to the dangers of using these hard drugs like cocaine and heroin, and get people to understand that they're doing themselves some damage. We've also, in the United Kingdom, we've cracked down on drug driving, and that's made quite a difference. We now, last year, we convicted 10,000 people of driving under the influence of drugs, and that's new laws that came in 2015, and that's no doubt having an effect.
Right. I'm going to jump to Mr. Burton here and talk about the situation overall, especially when we're talking about educational institutions. Now, many reports indicate that students, not just belonging to public schools, but very elite institutions, are also involved in the consumption of drugs. What do you think is happening within institutions that perhaps is fostering this culture or is pushing students to go and move towards trying drugs?
Well, I think in some ways what's happening is if we are a microcosm of society in our schools, then we shouldn't be surprised that sometimes there will be drugs in schools. And those capture the news headlines, particularly when they are, as you described them, the elite schools, where parents might be paying £30,000 a year and then suddenly they find that children are using drugs. I have to say, that has been the case over a number of years, and I'm not convinced that that is worse than it is now. I think what is worse, and I speak as somebody who was a head teacher myself for 15 years of a school in a rural part of the UK, is that drug gangs are using young people. They're targeting young people into criminal activity by either bribing them with drugs or getting them to carry drugs. And that has become quite a big issue as we've seen fewer police on the streets. And I think I'd go back to what Professor Johnston says. We have to educate young people and their parents, whose responsibility it is ultimately, to make sure that parents are aware of what might be going on beyond the school gates.
Right. That is an essential, and I do want to talk about how education needs to be more prevalent, not just amongst the students, but amongst their parents as well. But Mr. Burton, one of the things I do want to talk about is the global pressures that are mounting on students today. I mean, we understand that the situations we're living in are much more complex than, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago, with social media, with the global economy, with pressures coming out from every direction. Do you feel like that is one of the reasons why students often go and move towards the consumption of drugs?
Well, I represent 19,500 school leaders, and one of the things they say to me as the biggest concern for them is young people's mental health. And part of the fragility of mental health is about social media, because if you're trying to define who you are as a human being, and you're doing it in part by how many people like you on Facebook or retweet you on Twitter, then you get a different sense of who you might be. And it might be that some of those young people then turn to drugs. But equally, listen to what the professor says. Actually, drug use overall appears to be either stabilised or declining. So it's important that we don't blame social media or the media for everything. We just need to stay very vigilant and help young people to navigate their way through a complicated world.
Right. Professor Johnston, now, as you state, drug usage within the UK might be stagnant, might be declining. Global figures also indicate that it is moving towards an upwards trend. And from a holistic viewpoint, I do want to talk about this a little more and talk about the state of mental health when we're talking about the youth globally, not just in the UK. What are some of the indicators that parents need to be looking out for people in medical stores need to be looking out for? What type of legislation do you think needs to be introduced in places with weak laws to make sure that this is being countered?
Well, I would be very careful about introducing more laws. They don't necessarily help. The so-called war on drugs that the United States has led and spent multi-billion pounds or multi-billion dollars on really has resulted in a lot of people getting locked up, but not actually dealing with the problem. The problem is not going to be solved by locking people up or by legislation. It's not that simple. If it was that simple, there would be no drug misuse in the United States, because they've got the strongest laws of any of the countries out there on drug use. And they've been locking up more people than anyone else in the world per head of population. So it isn't an issue of just simply passing a law. The other thing is some countries have got lots of strong laws, but they don't actually enforce them.
Right. Mr. Barton, now Professor Johnston makes a very important point. Criminalizing those that are involved in the drug usage doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't really solve what is pushing them towards it. Now, as you mentioned, you represent a huge number of schools throughout the UK. In all of this, you talked about the fragility of mental health in the youth today. What can teachers, what can parents do to support young children, their journey? And what do you think needs to be done on that front?
I think there's probably two things. One, which Professor Johnston hints at, is a policy issue for government. Government needs to decide whether we continue to criminalise drugs in the way that we do, which we know drives the trade underground. That's a big policy decision for any government. But our responsibility for young people, I think, is to understand that the world is more complicated, to help parents to understand what the signs might be of their children getting involved in criminal activity related to drugs, and to help educate young people in a world which we know can leave them vulnerable, as to how do you show resilience to resist that? How do you say no if somebody offers you drugs? And that's something schools have always done, but we will need to redouble our efforts.
Right, on that point, thank you so much, Mr. Jeffrin, for joining us. Professor Johnston, moving back to you and talking more about this, you mentioned that legislation isn't the only way to move forward. There are a number of other things that need to be done. Now, one of the things I do want to talk about is rehabilitation and the process of moving forward. How necessary do you think that is, and what can be done for young adults specifically in this regard?
If we take smoking as an example, we've driven smoking off the agenda now. In the United Kingdom, we're down to 15% of the country now who smoke, and we've done that through education. And that's what we need to do with drugs. We need to point out the problems you're going to have and try and get people to understand that drugs are not going to help them. If anything, they're going to contribute to their poor mental health and the problems that go with that. And that's what it comes down to.
Right, but I'm talking more about the process towards. Now, as you mentioned, criminalizing students and people doesn't solve the problem. Now, if someone does have an addiction, that is a disorder, what needs to be done in the following steps? What needs to be done in order to try to rehabilitate them?
Well, we have in the United Kingdom, we have sophisticated drug treatment programs in place. We have drug workers in local areas, and we try and get people off drugs and try and keep them off drugs. And also, the other thing we try and do is supply them with substitutes which are clean and not going to do them any damage like street drugs are. And that does two things. It helps them because it's the drug is not going to damage them, but it also stops the people who are selling the drugs. It deprives them of the market and cuts the cost.
Right. On that point, I'd also like to use another guest who's joined us, Mr. Akshay Nanavati, who is the author of Fear Vana. He joins us from New Jersey. Thank you so much, Akshay, for joining us. Now, Akshay, we're talking about young adults. We're talking about the battles they're facing in the modern age, and we're also talking about how many more young people are moving towards drug addiction. Trying to understand this, what can you tell us about what pushes young people, their mental state, which might push them towards consuming drugs?
I think we live in an environment that makes it very conducive, if not almost inevitable, to pursue drugs. We're more lost than ever before. We're more disconnected than ever before. We're more confused than ever before. With too many choices, we actually don't make a decision. Psychologists call it the paradox of choice. So as a result, we're lost, we're confused, we don't have real human connection. And in a world where drugs are more easily accessible than ever before, it's almost inevitable that we find ourselves heading down that path. I mean, I myself have been down there as well when I was in high school. And it's growing across the world, right, in every country, in all corners of the globe, because of the nature of the environment that's cultivated it.
Right. And you're talking how they're becoming more and more accessible. Why do you think that is? What do you think are the main reasons for why students, young people are finding it more easy to actually indulge in this?
You know, I can't speak to the power systems and the power plays that allow it to get to the hands of these young kids more readily than ever before. I'm by no means an expert in all of that, but I do find that as far as from the level of the person seeking it, it just becomes easy to reach because we're craving something. You know, we also live in a world of instant gratification, our world that creates and cultivates this nature of getting things that we want as fast as humanly possible. So we're looking for these little dopamine jolts, right? We have our phones; these are little dopamine machines, constantly to inject little these feelings of joy and pleasure instantly. That we don't seek out meaningful struggle. We don't seek out adversity. We don't seek out a purposeful challenge. We just want to feel good. This kind of instantaneous, instant gratification, this hedonistic behavior patterns. And drugs are just an answer to that. Not to mention the young teenage brain is not even fully developed yet. So it's a brain that seeks out risk. It's a brain that seeks out these pathways. And drugs is an obvious solution in an environment that we see it everywhere across the globe. I see it in America, in India, in where I'm from, and it's just so readily available. And I can't speak to the power systems that create that, but that's at least why we seek it out.
Right, seeking it out, and you're talking about why people these days, and not just the young generation, but all people are becoming more hooked on to the idea of instant gratification. Now, of course, as we've been talking, it's not just about looking at the problem, it's trying to see beyond that, trying to see what factors lead to the problem. What do you think needs to be done in a meaningful way to engage with people who are starting to form these insecurities, are starting to form complexes because of this, moving towards instant gratification?
Yeah. I think, one solution is creating more meaningful in-person communities. I was one of this leading researcher in the space of addiction once said that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And I thought that was a very profound statement. I discovered this in my own healing from overcoming alcoholism and drug addiction, and finding meaningful, real, deep human connection, not social media connection, but in-person connection. So cultivating environments that create that, then foster and nurture human connection. Was it not Spain, but Portugal did a great example of this, of how they combated addiction by cultivating deep human connection and community. So that's one element. The other is creating avenues for people to pursue and engage in worthy struggles. I call it a worthy struggle. Like when you overcome addiction, when you come out of that darkness, that void needs to be filled with something. And often we make that mistake. I've lost friends to addiction because what happened is when they came out of it, they relapsed because they didn't fill that with something. A key need, a key human behavior, like what drives us, is a need to have purpose in our life, or need to have meaning. And we need to find something meaningful, something struggle. It has to be a struggle, a worthwhile challenge to pursue to give our lives meaning. And so from a young age, we can cultivate that by, instead of feeding into this mentality of saying, here's the easiest way to go do it, cultivate struggle. And parents can do this because parents often don't cultivate struggle because we think we're making our lives, the lives of our kids, better by making it easier, but we're not. We're only making it worse. Engage your kids in struggle, whether it be at a school level, at a parent level. Help them find and pursue a meaningful struggle. And that's how I conquered addiction twice, is by finding a purposeful challenge to follow and allowing that to consume my life, and then building a meaningful community around that as well. Those are the two most valuable things that I've discovered in terms of overcoming addiction and battling that.
Right. Professor Johnston now makes a number of very interesting points. Are there any specific points that you do disagree with or you agree with here?
Not at all. I agree very much with that. It's to give these people something meaningful to do, to drug misuse or drug use, whichever you call it. It's about sort of ducking out of life, whereas what these people really need is a purpose and to do something useful with their lives, whether it's a job or something else or an interest other than just sitting on a chair and vegging out with some sort of drug abuse or zoning out with some drug taking. They need to have a purpose in life, and that is so right.
Right. Professor Johnston, now, while we're talking about this, and I'm going to put this to Akshay as well, we do know that depression rates around the world are rising. Amongst people who go to school, amongst young adults, we've discussed all the societal factors that lead to it, social isolation, all of this. Now, this and reconciling with the idea of trying to bring purpose in one's life, it seems to be a very messy thing to make sense of. How do you think we can do that, Professor Johnston?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I had an answer to that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be out proselytizing about it, because that's really what needs to be done. People need to get a purpose in life, and we need to promote meaningful lives and to develop people's lives so that they feel they've got a part of society and that they've got something to contribute, rather than let society do things to them, that they take part in society and that they move society forward. Right.
Akshay, to the same point, how do we reconcile these two trends, these two things that are moving in opposite directions?
You know, I think a fundamental thing we can do to reshape our paradigm to depression or drugs or anything is actually to develop a positive relationship to the experience of pain and suffering. See, one of the reasons why we seek out drugs, or even in terms of our relationship to depression, we're looking to run away from pain. This ties into what I was saying earlier, right? Looking for a world that feeds the easiest path out. But see, the problem is not really depression or sadness. Now, I get there's a distinction. I know there's a chemical reaction in the brain. God knows I get it. I've struggled with depression for a long time in my life as well. But the real problem is our relationship to that experience of pain. There can actually be a lot of beauty in pain, a lot of beauty in the struggle, in the suffering, and saying that the real problem is not that I have depression, or not that depression is me, is the self-identity. It's that my brain goes through the state of depression from time to time, but I am not my brain, and my brain is not me. So I can use this pain in service of something. So actually learning to smile in the face of suffering, learning to say that this pain I'm experiencing is not me. So as an example, a mantra that I often use is, be with what is, but do not become what is. So I go through moments of depression all the time. 2 days ago, I was crying in my room because I hit a low moment that hit me hard. But I allow myself to feel that pain, be with that pain, and then use that pain in service of something meaningful.
Right. And Akshay, just to finish off our discussion here, you're talking about how you too have battled with depression, and you are one example of millions of other people who battle with the same emotions. You also mentioned community ties in this. When we're moving forward, there is idealism in hoping that community ties get stronger, but we're also seeing isolation grow more and more.
Absolutely.
What do you think needs to be done at a societal level for the community to actually bring about exercises in which it's not just talk, but something meaningful and practical is happening?
Yeah. You know, at a highest level, who knows what's going to make. So let's talk about it from a grassroots level, because who knows who's going to make changes at the big level. Just at a grassroots level, I mean, you can start community gatherings, you know, if it's a matter of school, like, and in fact, I'm working on this, creating Fearvana tribes, is have a group of kids get together to pursue a meaningful challenge. Like that's why people in sports, for example, often find purpose in their tribe, right? When you have that tribal culture in something that's a struggle, that consumes you. So you'll often see people in sports, that becomes their path, that becomes their avenue. So creating little communities in your towns, in your cities, whatever it may be, starting little gatherings for people to express vulnerability, because vulnerability builds connection, to find meaningful avenues to pursue that challenge, to allow ourselves to not be defined by these labels and say, look, I'm going through these things, right? And allowing yourself, giving that space to feel these things, but not saying that these things I feel are my self-identity, because that's a huge problem. I've worked with many young kids who will say things like, I have depression, or that I am depressed, as opposed to saying things that I'm just going through a state of depression, but that's not who I am. So
Right.
creating communities that kind of foster and create a new paradigm on the relationship to pain and suffering.
Right, on that point, I have to end the show, but thank you so much, Akshay Nanavati, for joining us from New Jersey, and Professor Atholl Johnston for joining us from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. You can always follow us on our social media, indus.news. Till then, goodbye and take care.